Kill anything, eh?
Kill the rest of your body too.
Yeah.
Video. Okay. Okay, and we're ready to start, inshallah. So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah, wa ba'd. All right, so we left off at section 30, and we are continuing some rules about marriage and divorce, inshallah ta'ala. So let's continue, and then we'll take questions at the end. So we left off here. We were on verse 232. All right, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, let me move this thing away. Move like further up. Okay, well, this will do. All right, so Allah says, وَإِذَا طَلَّقْتُمُ النِّسَاءَ فَبَلَغْنَ أَجَلَهُنَّ فَلَا تَعْضُلُوهُنَّ. I gotta move this. فَلَا تَعْضُلُوهُنَّ أَن يَنكِحْنَ أَزْوَاجَهُنَّ إِذَا تَرَاضَوْا بَيْنَهُم بِالْمَعْرُوفِ. So it says, when you have divorced women and they've reached the end of their waiting period, do not prevent them from remarrying their ex-husbands if they mutually agree with honor. Right? Meaning if they mutually agree to get married with honor. So this is pretty significant here. So basically it's continuing to talk about divorce and saying if somebody has engaged in the divorce process and there's a cooling off period like we talked about last week, then what happens is once they reach the end of the cooling off period, or what's called the iddah, or the waiting period, which is how long? Who remembers what the length is? Yes.
40 days?
Not 40 days.
3 months.
Yeah.
Is it 3 months?
4 months. Oh.
Is it 4 months?
Wait, what?
No?
No?
So we got 3 wrong answers so far. Yes.
Wait, what's the question?
3, not 3 months.
You told me it's 3 months.
Not 2 months.
6
Not 6 months. Okay.
Very cycle.
3 cycles. Okay. So 3 menstrual cycles, which is somewhere between 2 months and 10 days to about 3 months, depending on what happens. So 3 menstrual cycles is the waiting period. So once they're getting near the end of the waiting period and the divorce is about to finalize and be complete, and they're not going to be married anymore, right near the end of that waiting period, what does Allah says? He says, do not prevent them. And it says the do not is plural. So it's talking to the Muslim community. And when we talk to the Muslim community, we're primarily talking to the family. Do not prevent them from remarrying their ex-husbands, or basically, or either remaining married to their ex-husband if the period has not expired, or if the period expires, no longer husband and wife. Now, what happens if there's only 1 divorce? Can they get remarried?
Yes.
If there's 2 divorces, can they get remarried?
Yes.
If there's 3 divorces, can they get remarried? No. So if there's 1 divorce or 2 divorce, and 6 months later, 9 months later, 2 years later, they say, you know what? We should get remarried. You know what's going to happen? There are going to be many people in the family. They're going to be like, how dare you? How dare, I mean, imagine if your father or your uncle or someone, and somebody does that to your daughter or your niece, and they'll intervene and they'll say, how dare you? You did that to my daughter. I will not allow her to ever get remarried to you ever again. And now an honor issue kicks in. And you say, nope, I will stop you from doing that for your own good, because it's dishonorable and it's going to look bad in the community. And what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say? Do not prevent them from doing that. You are not allowed to come in with your own notions of what is honor and what you think is better. If they want to do that and they want to continue to either continue in the marriage or to get remarried, and they're going to do it with honor, bil ma'ruf, in a nice way, in the right way, then you have no right to stop them from doing that. Why? Because Allah says, ذَلِكَ يُعَظُ بِهِ مَنْ كَانَ مِنْكُمْ يُؤْمِنُ بِاللَّهِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ. Says, this is prescribed for whoever of you really believes in Allah in the last day. So this is very strong language. Allah is saying, do not interfere with your children or your niece or your family's desire to get remarried in this situation. And if you do, then you don't really believe in Allah in the last day. You're something is wrong with your faith if you're going with what you think is best, but Allah is telling you not to interfere. Don't get involved in issues like this. ذَلِكَ أَزْكَى لَكُمْ وَأَطْهَرُ. Why? Because that is purer and more honorable for you. Meaning there's a moral purity in remaining married. What's going to happen is if you are able to get married and then your family pressures you and prevents you from getting married, what's going to end up happening? You're going to have a lot of problems, right? There's going to be temptation here and temptation there and so many things going on. So Allah says, no, don't do that. وَاللَّهُ يَعْلَمُ وَأَنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Allah knows and you do not know. Meaning Allah knows what's better. Allah knows the rule of why did He allow this? If it was so bad the way you think and it's so dishonorable and we should not allow anyone to do this, why would Allah allow this? Allah is the one who sets the rule. And Allah knows that there's going to be this cultural push of excess honor that people have in their minds, and they're going to interfere. And Allah says, you're not allowed to interfere in this situation. And this is kind of the problem in society. Society, we have two exaggerations. We have two extremes. One extreme is there's no such thing as honor whatsoever. We've lost the concept of honor and respect and dignity and caring for your family and all of these things. This is one extreme. We find this a lot in American culture. Then you find in other cultures, you have this extreme sense of honor, like in Japanese culture and in Arab culture and in Desi culture. It's such an extreme. Like in Japanese culture, if you're dishonored, you go kill yourself. Right? That's how bad the honor has how extreme it's become. And you find in other cultures, Desi culture, Arab culture, and all that, you find the same thing. You say, no, you dishonored somebody like this, you're not allowed to get remarried anymore. Even though Allah is saying, no, this is an extreme. You're asserting your own whims and your own notions and conception of honor. Don't do that. So only people who have true faith, they're going to follow this guidance. Allah made it clear. When it comes to family intervention is understandable when you care and you have concern for your family. But when family intervention gets to the point of preventing you from doing something that's actually good for you or pure for you, or being able to, establish a halal relationship, and you make it so difficult, Allah is saying, don't come in and intervene. Don't interfere. And what we have is these two extremes. Some type of families, they simply don't care. Do whatever you want. I don't care. I don't even want to see who the guy is, who the girl is. Your problem. You live with it, whatever it is. I have no advice to you. What's your advice? No advice. Do whatever you want. I don't care. Other extreme is we will tell you exactly what to do. And we're going to guide every single step along the way. These are two extremes that are supposed to be avoided in Islam. The next verse, Allah says, وَالْوَالِدَاتُ يُرْضِعْنَ أَوْلَادَهُنَّ حَوْلَيْنِ كَامِلَيْنِ. Mothers should breastfeed their children for 2 whole years. So basically it's saying mothers are able to. When they say should, doesn't mean that they must. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's highly, highly recommended. Or maybe there's like a slight recommendation. Now, in the context, we've been talking about divorce. So it's combining two things together. It's talking about children. What is their food going to be for the first 2 years? And it's talking about what if there's a divorce Now what's the food going to be for the first 2 years when it comes to children? So little babies, they drink milk. They drink their mother's milk. So it's saying that mothers, even if they've been divorced, they're going to breastfeed their children for 2 entire years. Now, there's been this debate in the 60s and the 70s and about 50 years ago about formula versus breast milk. And it was a big trend in the 60s and 70s and 80s and things like that. People were like, you know what? There's nothing special about breast milk. Just use formula. It's going to be simple and it's easier. And we put nutrients in there and it's going to be healthier. And now the medical opinion has shifted. And they say, no, actually the natural breast milk that Allah has created is the healthiest thing that you could possibly find for any children, right? So we find that something going back to the natural way that Allah has made things. Then it says, لِمَنْ أَرَادَ أَن يُتِمَّ الرَّضَاعَ. That is for anyone who wishes to complete the nursing. If you want to complete the nursing of your child and not wean them off earlier than that, that's the normal period of time that children will be suckled for, they'll be breastfed for. وَعَلَى الْمَوْلُودِ لَهُ رِزْقُهُنَّ وَكِسْوَتُهُنَّ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ. It says the child's father should provide food and clothing for the mother honorably, meaning during that period when the child is being fed. So again, we're back on the topic of divorce now. So even if a divorce takes place and they're not husband and wife anymore, you still have the mother going to be taking care of that child for at least the 2 years of nursing. So the responsibility of the husband, or not husband anymore, the responsibility of the father of that child remains for the period that the child is going to be fed at that time. So this will be called like the minimal child support. But we're not talking about child support just for the children. We're talking about spousal support, which is another category, because of the fact that she's going to be taking care of this child during the time. لا تكلف نفس إلا وسعها. No one should be charged with more than they can handle. Now this is really beautiful. We're talking about divorce in general. We're talking about the family system. But then Allah puts in these general principles that not only apply in marriage and divorce, they apply across the board in all aspects of life. So no one is going to be responsible for more than they can handle. Now we go back in the same context. This verse continues. لا تضار والدة بولدها ولا مولود له بولده. No mother should be harmed due to her child, and no father should be harmed due to his child. So where's the harm? The harm is going to be two things. What's the harm for the mother going to be? In this context, what would the harm be? So not being provided for. So she is nursing the child, and that takes toll on you, and it makes it difficult for you to work, and maybe be difficult for you to get remarried because you're breastfeeding your child and all of that stuff. And now she's going to also have to take care of herself financially. So that would be very difficult if she's doing both of these things. What would the difficulty be on the father? What would it be? What would be the harm? Like they're saying you should not be harmed too much. So if the mother had to do all of this herself, it would be too much harm. What would the father's harm be if there was going to be harm? Yeah.
Maybe not being allowed to see the child or asking too much of the father.
More of the second one, right?
Okay.
So asking too much from the father in terms of too much financial support or too long financial support. They say, you know what? No, you have to give this for 2 decades, instead of 2 years or something like that. So if it becomes really long, then it's going to be too difficult for the father. So basically the first principle was no one is going to be responsible for more than they can handle. Second principle is, even though the child, the mother and father are like, the closest thing to the child, parents love their children, right? They have a responsibility towards their children. They have a love towards their children. Even despite that, your closest relationship you have, you should not be overburdened. Mother should not be overburdened. Father should not be overburdened. Right? And this is a huge problem today because many people, there's such high expectations within the culture that oftentimes parents feel that they're being overburdened when it comes to their children because of all the responsibilities that are put on them and the way we live our modern life and so many other things. So anyways, this is more of an American problem than it is of a problem in other countries. You read books like Bringing Up Bebe, or if you read other books that say this is how things get tackled in Scandinavia or in France or in other countries, which are just as egalitarian in their cultural social structure as in America, there seems to be an excessive pressure in America that people are reporting when it comes to the obligation or the stress that comes from raising their children. And there's many factors for that, but we won't get into it. And then Allah says, وَعَلَى الْوَارِثِ مِثْلُ ذَلِكَ. And on the heirs, meaning the father's heirs, they will have the same responsibility like that. So that means caring for the child in case the father dies. The father is supposed to take care of the mother during this period of time. What if he dies? It's a legitimate question. What happens if he dies? It says, you know what? His heirs, the people who are going to inherit from him, they're going to be financially responsible. So the responsibility continues regardless of that. Then it says, فَإِنْ أَرَادَ فِصَالًا عَنْ تَرَاضٍ مِّنْهُمَا وَتَشَاوُرٍ فَلَا جُنَاحَ عَلَيْهِمَا. But if both, meaning both parents, they decide to wean the child means we're going to cut off just feeding milk and we're going to start giving solid food to the children before this 2-year period. If they both decide to wean the child, عَنْ تَرَاضٍ, after consent, so they have to mutually agree. They both have to agree on the decision. وَتَشَاوُرٍ, the word tashawur comes from shura, and shura means consultation. So it's saying, you know what? There needs to be mutual agreement. There needs to be consultation between them. If they do that, there's nothing wrong with that. So this is beautiful language if you look what Allah is saying. Allah is using this and saying this is what's normally going to happen, slightly recommended. But if they decide they don't want to do that, and they both agree, and they have consulted with one another, they talked it out, they discussed it, there's nothing wrong with that. It's perfectly fine if you go ahead and do that. But this verse sets a very important principle, and that is mutual agreement on important things like this and discussion. You can't just simply make the decision and say, we're not even going to discuss the issue at all. There should be discussion that takes place. وَإِنْ أَرَدْتُمْ أَن تَسْتَرْضِعُوا أَوْلَادَكُمْ فَلَا جُنَاحَ عَلَيْكُمْ إِذَا سَلَّمْتُمْ مَا آتَيْتُمْ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ. If you choose to have your children breastfed, meaning by another woman, then there's nothing wrong with that if you're willing to give up payment for that fairly. So now it's saying, there's something called a wet nurse. And you say, you know what? We don't want to use formula. We don't want to start feeding the children solid food yet. We don't want to wean them because breastfed milk is better for them. But it's too difficult for the mother to provide the milk. She's busy, whatever it is, something happens. So, okay, you don't have that responsibility. We'll get somebody else to do it. This is very, very common throughout history. In fact, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he had a wet nurse as well. Does anyone know what her name was? Halima. Very good. So her name was Halima. So he was also breastfed by her, and many, many people, they engage in a process like this, and they usually, because the woman is doing the service, you have to pay her. But remember the principle we said, no father should be harmed on behalf of his child. So if he's paying the mother, but she's not doing that job, and he's paying the other woman, what happens now? It's not fair. So what does Allah say? We have to rebalance the entire equation and make it fair again. How can we make it fair? Well, it's perfectly fine if you choose somebody else to do that, but then you have to give up the payment that was originally going to go, and that payment's going to go to somebody else. That's the way you make it fair. Because if someone's not doing a job, then the payment for that is going to be redirected to the person who's going to be doing the job. A very, very simple system, a very fair system. وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ وَاعْلَمُوا أَنَّ اللَّهَ بِمَا تَعْمَلُونَ بَصِيرٌ. Be mindful of Allah and know that Allah sees what you do. So this is the basic provisions when it comes to breastfeeding, and when it comes to what happens if they split and there's a divorce that takes place. What do you do when it comes to breastfeeding in that situation? The next verse, والذين يتوفون منكم ويذرون أزواجا يتربصن بأنفسهن أربعة أشهر وعشرا. For those of you who die and you leave behind widows, now this is not talking to people who are already dead, okay? So it says, for those of you who die, it's not like, by the way, in case you died, we want to tell you something. This is before you die. So if you're going to die, or you might die, and you're going to leave behind a widow, they should keep to themselves for 4 months and 10 days. Now, what does keep to themselves mean? It means that they're not going to get remarried for the period of 4 months and 10 days. This does not mean, like some people, they think this is like a house arrest where a woman's not allowed to leave her house for any reason whatsoever. She just gets locked in her room or something like that. This is not the case. It's talking primarily about getting remarried. Okay, so they're not going to get remarried for 4 months and 10 days. When a woman is divorced, she's not going to get remarried for a period of, what did we mention? We saw quite a few incorrect answers, but now we should know the correct answer. 3 cycles, right? 3 cycles. And if a woman doesn't have cycles due to her age, then it's going to be 3 months. But if her husband dies, it's going to be 4 months and 10 days. This is called iddah. And there's 2 types of iddah. There's an iddah of a woman who's divorced, and there's an iddah of a woman who's widowed, meaning her husband has passed away. Okay, the similar principle here. فَإِذَا بَلَغْنَ أَجَلَهُنَّ فَلَا جُنَاحَ عَلَيْكُمْ فِي مَا فَعَلْنَ فِي أَنفُسِهِنَّ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ. Once they've reached the end of this period, 4 months and 10 days, then there's nothing wrong with what they decide for themselves honorably. Meaning, if they want to get remarried honorably, they want to start searching for somebody else in a nice way, don't interfere. So look at the wording very carefully. What they decide for themselves. So the woman gets to decide. If she wants to get remarried, don't put pressure on her. If she doesn't want to get remarried, don't put pressure on her. She's going to make that decision right after this period is going to be complete. It's going to be finished. So again, it goes back to the idea of responding to family pressure. You see the wording here, because remember, Islam came in a tribal society of Arabia. Family system was very strong. And the sense of honor was very strong, and clan honor and family honor and all of that. And it was kind of tilted towards the other extreme that we talked about. We got kind of like the American extreme, where it's a sense of honor is like gone. And then you got the Japanese ancient Arab extreme of honor, right? So this one was tilted in that extreme. Allah is responding to that and saying, leave them alone. There's nothing wrong with what they choose to do for themselves. Don't interfere. Don't put pressure on them unnecessarily. Let them decide whatever they want, because done honorably, bil ma'ruf. Rather than, otherwise they're going to be pressured to doing some secret stuff and whatever it is. This is not right. Don't do that. Wallahu bima ta'maluna khabir. Allah knows what you do. What is that referring to? The pressure. If you're interfering and you shouldn't be interfering, Allah knows that you're interfering. So don't interfere. Don't intervene. Don't cause problems within the family. وَلَا جُنَاحَ عَلَيْكُمْ فِي مَا عَرَّضْتُمْ بِهِ مِنْ خِطْبَةِ النِّسَاءِ أَوْ أَكْنَنْتُمْ فِي أَنفُسِكُمْ. There's nothing wrong with you showing interest in women, or if you keep it in your hearts. And I put the parentheses here because you have to read the context. Context is divorce and death. So there's nothing wrong with you showing interest in a woman who's been divorced or a woman whose husband has passed away, even if it's during the waiting period, during the iddah. So she's not allowed to get married. But then now the question is for the men. Well, you know that she's in her waiting period. She's not allowed to get married. Are you allowed to show interest in her? Can you go up to her and say, you know what? I know you're not allowed to get remarried right now, but you know what? I'm interested in getting married, and I might consider you. You seem like a pretty good person. You know, are you allowed to do that, or are you not allowed to do that? Right? So there's going to be a little problem there, Because technically you're not allowed to get remarried, but then if you go and you approach somebody, this is kind of awkward, this is kind of weird. So now Allah is going to set out some very clear rules on whether this is okay or it's not okay. So the first thing he's saying is that, yeah, it's okay. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with that. Even if it's during the waiting period, yeah, I might consider marriage. So it's okay if you say it, and it's okay if you don't say it. You're going to keep it in your heart and just kind of be like, I'm just going to keep quiet about it. And when she's ready to get remarried, then I'm going to go ahead and offer a proposal. علم الله أنكم ستذكرونهن ولكن لا تواعدوهن سرا إلا أن تقولوا قولا معروفا. Allah knows that you will mention them. Meaning that whether you say it or you don't say it, Allah knows that either you're going to say it now or you're going to say it at the end of the iddah or the waiting period. So Allah knows that you're going to make a proposal soon. But what you're not allowed to do, so you have the choice. You can show some interest or you can keep it to yourself. But what you're not allowed to do not make a secret commitment with them. Meaning, do not promise that you're going to marry them, right? And say, I promise I will marry you the day it's over. You don't got to look at anybody else. You don't have to worry about anything right now. I want to put your mind at ease. This is a done deal. You're not allowed to do that. It says you can only show some interest in them. Ma'rufa. Qawlan ma'rufa means appropriately. You have to speak nicely. This is where the honor comes back in. There's a respectful way to do that. So how can you do that? You go up to somebody, say the husband passed away or whatever it is, and you say, and scholars actually explain these terms in the books of fiqh, in the books of Islamic law. So they actually give you statements. This is what you can say. We actually have to study this in school. So they go, you can go to someone and say, you know what? I'm sorry what happened, with your husband, he passed away. And, I'm sure it's difficult for you right now. Be patient. So Allah will send somebody your way. You seem like a really nice person. And, I went through something, recently too. And I'm also, searching for somebody to get married. Inshallah, Allah will open both of our paths for us. That's a simple way of being like, hey, maybe there's a hint or something like that. So you can give a hint, but don't make a promise, because that would be, that would be inappropriate, because you're not allowed to get remarried right now. So Allah says, don't do that. There's a right way to go about that. وَلَا تَعْزِمُوا عُقْدَةَ النِّكَاحِ حَتَّى يَبْلُغَ الْكِتَابُ أَجَلَهُ. Do not commit to the contract of marriage until the waiting period expires. Because if you did, then you're breaking the whole point of there being a waiting period, right? So that's not supposed to be there. That's not supposed to happen. And remember, the waiting period is connected to pregnancy as well, as we talked about last time. وَاعْلَمُوا أَنَّ اللَّهَ يَعْلَمُ مَا فِي أَنفُسِكُمْ فَاحْذَرُوهُ. And know that Allah knows what is in your hearts, so beware of Him. So be careful. Allah knows what's in your heart, and if you decide to go against the rules that Allah is telling you to do, be careful. Because Allah knows that you're thinking about doing something. Maybe you're thinking about crossing a line, but you should be very careful before you cross any of those lines. وَاعْلَمُوا أَنَّ اللَّهَ غَفُورٌ حَلِيمٌ. Know that Allah is forgiving and patient. So you say, well, wait a minute, Allah is forgiving for people who ask for forgiveness. If you make a mistake and you do something that you're not supposed to do, what do? Ask Allah for forgiveness. Allah is patient. What does the patience here mean? Patience means that Allah doesn't punish the people who do something wrong and they're sinners and they don't ask for forgiveness. He's going to hold people accountable, but He's not going to hold them accountable right now. Imagine if He did. Every single time you did something, you told a lie, you get struck by lightning. That would be a big problem, right? Huge problem. Every time some little things happens, like you skip a prayer, all of a sudden you get the flu, you get sick for 2 weeks. Be difficult, right? Allah is Halim. Allah is patient. He's forbearing. He's not punishing people right now. He's giving them some time. He's letting them see the consequence of their actions, giving them some time to think about whether they want to make tawbah, whether they want to ask Allah for forgiveness. That's what it means in this context. So, as you can see here, you can see that Allah addresses so many details when it comes to the family system. Why? because the family is something that's extremely important. And he addresses, well, what if this happens? And happens? And what if this doesn't happen? And what if that happens? This becomes the entire basis for the field of fiqh or Islamic law. All the what ifs. So when you get to wudu, right, it's like, well, what if I wash my left arm before my right arm? Does Allah address that in the Quran? Does he say directly, if you accidentally wash your left arm before your right arm? He doesn't, there's no verse like that, right? But there's verses like this. Well, what if this happens? And what if this happens? And what if you don't want to continue breastfeeding? And what if you want to wean? And what if you want to get a wet nurse? So Allah does that he addresses those verses in a few places in the Quran. And what we're supposed to do, and what scholars have done later on, is they said, well, if Allah gave so many details in this chapter, then what we can do is we can apply what's called qiyas, or analogy. And we can say, since all these questions were asked in this chapter about divorce, we can ask the same questions about marriage. Are you allowed to get married over Zoom, over a telephone call, over a letter? I mean, now there was no Zoom back then, right? Are you allowed to get married over a letter, right? Like, can you write a letter proposing, saying, you know what, I'm sending you a proposal, and then somebody writes back and say, yes, I have accepted your proposal, and there's witnesses, and your family is looking at the letter, and they're signing off on it, and then you send it back and you mail it back by camel, right? And then it arrives. Is this marriage going to be valid? Right? The scholars discuss that. Why did they come up with these questions? Because they're like, well, there's so many issues addressed in one chapter, one subject that Allah addressed in the Quran. So we can apply this to any other subject when it comes to prayer, when it comes to fasting. If I eat this, what if this happens? Will it break my fast? What if I get an injection? Will it break my fast? Ramadan is coming up. We have all these questions, right? Are these valid questions or not? You have sometimes people will say, don't ask questions like this, because what is the name of this surah? Baqarah. What is the incident about the Baqarah? The people ask too many questions. So they say, well, wait a minute, what about all these questions? Isn't this like the Baqarah where they ask so many questions about, well, what if this cow, and what if that cow, and what if the cow is yellow, and what if the cow is this? Was there a difference between these kind of questions that Allah is addressing and those kind of questions when it came to the cow? What's the difference? What's the main difference? They were trying to be difficult, right? They were not sincere. They were trying to make excuses of not sacrificing the cow. Here, you're trying to figure out what is it that Allah really wants you to do. So the basis for asking questions is in detailed verses like that. So when you read it the first time, you'd be like, why so much detail? It's only detail on a few things. Allah does not give you the same amount of detail when it comes to wudu, when it comes to prayer, when it comes to fasting. You don't have verses like that in the Quran. If you did, the Quran would be 60,000 pages instead of 600 pages. And then your Taraweeh prayer would be 10 hours instead of an hour and a half. But it's not. Allah gave you a few places where He goes into so much detail. What if this? What if that? What if this? What if that? And now you're like, well, I can apply the same way of thinking that I just learned in these verses into any other chapter when it comes to economics, when it comes to prayer, when it comes to fasting, when it comes to death and burial, when it comes to any other thing. And that's exactly what scholars did. And they made this field of science called fiqh in Islamic law. All right. With that, we take questions, inshallah. Yes.
In the case of divorce without children being present, what is the time period for spousal support?
So there is no specific time period for spousal support, but next week we're going to see that there is a concept of giving a gift of spousal support. So it's basically there, but Allah did not specify a particular amount of time. Why he didn't do that was there are some things which He left open for culture. Because people are going to be different in different cultures. If you're a farmer in Nigeria, you're going to have a different concept of spousal support than if you live in, Switzerland or like, some major city like in the world. It's going to be different. Economics are different. The way the family system is structured is going to be different. So He left that open.
So follow and not to derail.
Yeah.
So in Desi culture, sometimes the mahar is seen as like a gift. Well, I guess the confusion between mahar is sometimes that it's a gift and sometimes that it's a, in case of divorce, is to sustain her. for a
Yeah.
certain amount of time, right?
So this idea of mahar or the bridal gift, which actually is going to be next week as well,
Mm.
but I'll just answer it now anyways. Sometimes people are viewing it nowadays as a financial security, rather in case of divorce or something like that. This was not the case throughout history. This is a modern phenomenon, right? So a bridal gift is a gift. It was designed to be a gift. Now, can there be some additional financial security that's negotiated into a marriage contract? You can do that. But the purpose behind the mahar or bridal gift was not supposed to be that. That was not the purpose behind it. It was simply a gift. Okay. Other questions? All right, so we're gonna have one more week of family and family law, and then we're gonna start getting into other aspects, inshallah, to Surah Al-Baqarah, inshallah. So we will see you next week. Subhanakallahumma bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum.